Right, so greetings, hello. Blessings and peace this Sunday, the 16th of June. So this is Thomas Daffin again speaking for my weekly broadcast here from France about the state of the world. It's a kind of geopolitical overview, and from a spiritual, metaphysical and philosophical perspective. I'm speaking as a philosopher, metaphysician and coordinator of Philosophers of Peace in Europe and other organisations which I'm going to be speaking about. So I'm obviously very concerned about recent events. Last week I recorded a talk on Pentecost, and it was a beautiful day. I'm very worried that the world doesn't seem to be getting the message of the Holy Spirit. What else do we have to do to get this across that there's good news? It's unbelievable to me that the constant hubbub of war, now we have this complete ridiculous nonsense of some kind of war against Iran promoted in certain media channels, and however much it's contradicted by facts, the media just go on pumping it out. So we have Bolton saying he's going to take this to the UN. We have Trump, on this obviously fake staged attack on tankers in the Gulf, which were holed above the waterline, so they weren't, as alleged, Iranian submarines or anything. And we have the tanker owner, a Japanese firm, actually saying this and saying that these were hit by flying objects. So nothing to do with Iran. It was the Iranians who actually rescued these people and brought them to safety. So, and the other tankers owned by Norwegians who said the same thing. Japan is currently trying to mediate. The Japanese Prime Minister has put himself forward as a good officer's mediator to try and talk sense into the Iranian-American dialogue. European Union also, I think, should have its own mediation service. I've been campaigning about this for years, which should offer neutral, truthful mediation. The world cannot afford a war in the Middle East, another war. We're barely recovered from the chaos unleashed by the Iraq invasion in 2003. Any kind of attack on Iran would be horrendous. The results are incalculable, and it always comes to a bad end when the Roman Empire tries to attack Iran. Emperor Julian tried, the last pagan emperor of Rome. He died in the operation. It's a complete nightmare. So I'm going to be addressing this problem and giving some antidotes to what I think can be done. The Japanese mediation, it should be taken seriously and applied. My own specialised mediation service called the Multi-Faith and Multicultural Mediation Service, which was set up in 1996, is the only mediation service in the world that focuses specifically on the faith aspects of conflict and resolving through conflict resolution mediation the religious dimensions. And obviously there's a complete ignorance within the US mainstream media about Iran. They have this Sophia-phobic image of Iranians as all terrorists sponsoring, illegal terrorism and so on. But it's psychologically, it's what we call projection, a lot of it, because and the Iranians have a reverse image. They see the West as diabolic, literally. And they believe that the US they call it the Great Satan, has been a manufacturer of lies and misinformation and disinformation since the Vietnam War and before. When they got inside the American embassy in Tehran, they must have found lots of documents that really annoyed them. We know that the West was involved with supporting the Shah, who was using torture on his people and so on. And so, there's a lot of old business that has never been resolved between the US and the UK to some extent, which has been complicit in the US's belligerence. Normally the UK takes a more moderate line, and I'm going to be speaking about that in terms of what should be the UK's foreign policy response. We should be, in my opinion, offering to mediate between the US and Iran. And Scottish voices of reason are saying that, you know, it's not in the interests of the UK as a whole, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, you know, all the different regions of England, to suddenly be swept up into a war against Iran, which is not an enemy of the UK in any shape or size, not a threat. I listened to an Intelligence Squared debate about Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is far more of a threat to the UK's interests globally, and notwithstanding what the media says, their version of Islam is much less tolerant than the Iranian version, actually. If you study Shiism and Sunnism comparatively, as I've done over the years, and I'm working on a commentary on the Quran, have been for 10 years, it's a very detailed, exhaustive, line-by-line commentary, just coming up to its final conclusion. You know, the Shia and the Sunni have complementary and parallel types of explanations of the Quran. There's a whole tradition called tafsir, which is commentary on the Quran, which is what I'm doing. And it's a profound work, the Quran. I would like to see, instead of war against Iran, I'd like to see peace between the Shia and Sunni people of Islam. That's one of my projects, is a peace commission to establish peace between the Shia and Sunni. The conflict in Yemen is all about that. The conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran is all about that. The West should not get involved, swept up, take sides, back Saudi Arabia against Iran, you know, and sell weapons to them so they can bash Iran. No, it's immoral, that. What the West should be doing is remembering its own best conscience as people, as in Britain and America, not be completely neutral and try and prevent any war breaking out in the Middle East. It's very unlikely that Saudi Arabia or Israel would attack Iran alone unless they felt they had an umbrella from the US and the UK, and we should deny them such an umbrella. It's not in the interests of the UK or the US to see a major war break out in the Middle East. It's not in the interests of Israel or even Saudi Arabia. It might be in the interests of some of the ruling elites of Saudi Arabia and of Israel to see such a war break out. But then I'll come to that point in a minute, because that's the problem. We have a sociology of ignorance going on, in which ruling elites, who are the people with their fingers on the levers of the military-industrial intelligence complex, and I'm extending Eisenhower's concept to a threefold thing as a Druid. We have to include the intelligence community, because they're creaming the money in, the NSA, etc., who are going after Assange. They have billions and billions at their disposal. Peace movement have nothing, except truth. You'll see behind me the Druid Sword of Truth, which is, as peace officer of the Druid Council of Britain and Europe, I'm duty-bound to tell the truth. The Sword of Truth is all we have. But that is itself far more powerful than any army that can exist on the earth plane. So good luck to the Japanese in mediating. How can we find wisdom to replace the conflicts in Yemen and Saudi Arabia and so on? What can we find? Well, to me, we have to analyse the causes of it. And some good people are exposing, the lies that John Bolton and Trump and co are calling about an attack by Iran. I mean, Iran is a very, very sophisticated, intelligent, ancient, spiritually advanced culture with a civilization older than, the USA, far, far older and wiser. And it should be approached with respect. If you listen to the president of Iran's speech at the UN General Assembly when it was launched around the time of the autumn equinox, when the new session of the General Assembly met, he speaks with incredible gravitas and intellect. And this is a nation which has produced some of the greatest philosophers, that have been known to history. Don't forget, Rumi wrote his poetry in Persian. And Islamic Persian literature is unbelievably profound. One of the greatest philosophers of world history is a man called Mullah Sadra, who again wrote in Persian. And as a philosopher, I've studied these people. One of the greatest Islamic philosophers at the moment alive on the planet is Saeed Hossein Nasr, who is Iranian and who teaches in America. But he knows the history and depth of Iranian philosophy and spirituality and science, because these were the pioneers of astronomy and mathematics. In Baghdad, a lot of the great intellectuals were Persian. So we should be having a wisdom race, not an arms race. The great thinkers of the Islamic world, the Iranian world, the Shia, the Sunni, the Arab world, the European world. I'm speaking as coordinator of the World Intellectual Forum. I would invite these people to come forward, join us in our work in the World Intellectual Forum to bring a counterbalance to the madness of the World Ignorance Forum, which is all I can say, the military-industrial complex, they may have millions on their side, but they have no truth. They have lies, and they have, such a backlog of lies. It's unbelievable. So join me in the work of the World Intellectual Forum. Let's let truth force shine a light on these conflicts and prevent this possible, the latest of their escapades, a war against Iran. It's a complete nonsense. I want to talk first about the lies, the aggregation of lies, where we are with that, because as a philosopher I've studied ignorance. I think that we philosophers have to also look at the counterforce to philosophy, which is ignorance, and the different types of it. And I think the most profound cause of ignorance is misinformation and a lie. Now, we all have within us a kind of instinct for understanding what is truth and what is false. As children, it's the first thing we're taught by our parents, if we're taught well. Parents, tell their kids to tell the truth, and it's very important. As a teacher of religious studies for many years, obviously that's something I would get across to the kids. It's very important to learn to tell the truth. But for that, you have to be able to distinguish between the two. Well, every religion says we have that. It's called our conscience in the West and European philosophical concepts. That's a Latin phrase. The synderesis was the Greek equivalent. This inner voice that speaks to us and knows right from wrong. In the Quran, it's called the criterion, the Furqan. We have a criterion that knows to distinguish right from wrong, built into us. And the Quran itself is an exteriorization, a manifestation of that, as are all the holy texts and sacred books of mankind, from the whole of the prophetic lineages that have come to mankind and every tribe, as the Quran says. So, yet we are in this crisis of lack of truth. So, let me trace some of the untruths. Let's look at some of the history of it. I think, to tell the whole history of lies in human geopolitical history would take me, a lecture lasting a year. But I'll just start with 9/11, which is something I'm very interested in as a historian. I've just finished writing a 2-volume work on what happened, not just on the day, but in the run-up to 9/11, 2 days before 9/11. The great Afghan leader, Shah Ahmad Massoud, was killed. So obviously that was a connected incident. Somebody killed him. Then they went for New York and Washington. I've taken as the starting point of my study that the official narrative that Bush Jr.'s presidency came up with a couple of years later, which blamed it all on Al-Qaeda and a man in a cave, in Afghanistan somewhere, bin Laden, simply cannot be true. It's not true. Therefore, it's actually a lie. And so the facts are that the architects and engineers who researched this, and I'm taking them at their word, I'm not an expert, either architect or engineer, but I've read their literature. I believe it's sound, and I believe it demonstrates beyond a shadow of doubt, I think in forensic legal terms, it demonstrates that the buildings of New York, which is a city I know and love well, my heart is in New York, I love that city, right? I was born up the road in Montreal. And they were pre-wired, those buildings. They could not have been brought down by these two planes. Now, so it implies that somebody had forewarning of the attacks on 9/11 and pre-wired the buildings. Now, they found in the dust evidence of nanothermite, which was a very destructive substance. Only military forces can have access to this, so it implicates some kind of high-up military conspiracy. So my book just starts from that. That's the facts, really, scientifically speaking. I mean, as a scientist, and people question, are you a scientist, are you an empiricist? Yes, absolutely, 100%. Because I don't believe transpersonal history can be built on anything other than empiricism. I'm a spiritual empiricist, however. I do believe in the evidence of spiritual phenomena and so on, but examined scientifically. So as a spiritual empiricist and a factual historian scientifically, we just have to accept that those buildings did not come down with the two planes. They were pre-wired. And that means then somebody else planned it. And my book, 2 volumes, is the first ever historical study to look into that, to say, well, given that as a starting hypothesis, who might have pre-wired these buildings and why, for what reasons? Why on earth would anybody be able to correlate with what these Al-Qaeda people seem to have been planning? And I'm taking that there probably were Al-Qaeda involvement, and there was an attack, and there were planes, flying in. I don't go with the kind of their videogram type simulations. I think the evidence is no, there were real planes. But who was behind it? And then I spend 2 volumes studying that. I've come up with about 20 different hypotheses of who it could have been. It could have been an internal cabal within the American administration, a rogue unit within, CIA, Pentagon, whatever. It could have been a rogue unit that could have been known by certain elements of the Bush cabinet, who were, after all, talking about, a new Pearl Harbor event was needed, etc. It could have been an external foreign power to the US. It could have been country X, Y, or Z. And I look at several possible candidates who could have plotted with Al-Qaeda for bringing it down. And, I've got into it with a fine-tooth comb. I mean, external candidates include Saudi Arabia, China, Russia, and a few others. They all had motives, and they all had reasons, and they had enough money to buy a few corrupt people to pre-wire those buildings, and pay off some hush money to some corrupt CIA people and even Bush-type people. So I've explored all of this in forensic detail. You can read the volumes, they're now published. I would love them to be published by Penguin or someone and be in every single bookshop in the world. And let's have a debate about it. I'm setting up an international historical commission for 9/11. I'm the first historian to put his neck above the parapet and say we need to get to the truth of this. When I did my degree in history at the University of London, and I was taught by some of the best historians in Britain and internationally, I sat at their feet and went to lectures. And then I did my PhD in history and intellectual history, and I looked a great deal at the methodology of historical scholarship. So all that is in this book. I'm saying that 9/11 presents a huge challenge to historians, not just because it's so difficult to get the information, but also because there's so much information. Also because there's so much information we still don't have access to, and I list the kinds of things we need to have access to get the real truth. And then I also, it raises questions for the philosophy of history. If such a huge event, which has rippled out on world history since, is unknown, the cause of it, what are historians doing? They're all sleeping on the job. Why aren't there hundreds of historians analysing this? Why is it left to me? I'm busy. So that's why I'm setting up a commission of historians. I want every single nation that lost people in that terrible attack to contact me, their senior historian. I want one from each nation, like the top professor who runs their Royal Historical Society. I want totally neutral historians who haven't got an axe to grind, don't want to blame this or that country, but are just proper historians. They're committed to truth, like Toynbee or someone, people of that stature. And so if you know any, please ask them to contact me. That's an aggregation of lies. 9/11 is where it all begins to go wrong. And then soon after that, we had the Iraq War. Now, I remember marching in London in February 2003, trying to stop that, along with a million other people, and we were completely ignored. We knew the allegations that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. We knew these were lies. They were parroted by Jack Straw, Tony Blair. They lied to the Parliament, 100% through their teeth, for some preset ends that still we don't know why. Were they brainwashed to think that they were telling the truth? I suspend judgment on that, but what we do know is that the arguments in favour of any invasion of Iraq were 100% bogus. Weapons of mass destruction. The Americans were even saying, well, he was involved with 9/11. The whole thing was a mass deception caused by the propaganda in the media. And we're seeing the same thing now in the run-up to a possible attack on Iran. Now, anyone that lived through that 2003 build-up can see through this game. I'm coordinating Philosophers of Peace and Historians of Peace, and I was then. And that's why I was marching. Our only weapon is the sword of truth, which is all we can wield. But it's an important weapon, and there should still be investigations. There was the Chilkoot Commission of Inquiry, which found that there was deception and incompetence, but its remit was set so narrowly by Gordon Brown, who was then Prime Minister, that it wasn't allowed to ask the bigger questions. The Chilkoot Commission was never allowed to ask of the people it interviewed, did you feel that the preparation for the war in Iraq was justified? Were you told that it was because of 9/11? Were you told anything about the connections between the two? Because there was that nearly 2 years between September the 11th, 2001 down to March 2003. It's just under 2 years, 1.5 years. That time is critical, and if I'd have been chairing the Chilkoot Commission, I would have insisted that the two were looked at together. What did British intelligence know about the causes of 9/11, if anything? What were we told? Etc., etc. Whereas to airbrush the connection out of the carpet, as has been attempted by the so-called mainstream media, which you have to realise are disinformation channels in the pay of the military-industrial intelligence complex, which I've talked about. So that's not the truth. So if I'd have been chairing the Chilkoot Commission, it would have been entirely different. Chilkoot actually is a kind of historian, and Martin Gilbert, who was a historian on that panel, Lawrence Freedman, an old colleague of mine, Professor of War Studies at my university, the University of London. I should be Professor of Peace Studies there, and he should be my counterpart, but for some obscure reason, the University of London didn't want to fund the chair of Peace Studies. You can still change your mind, folks. You can still come in from the cold. So yes, that commission, the Chilkoot Commission with Gilbert and Chilcott and Freeman, should have asked some really important questions. It didn't. It lost the plot by this is a kind of myopia that's done institutionally to prevent people asking the profound contextual questions. Another problem with the Chilkoot Commission was it was carried out under the terms of the Privy Council, which means total secrecy, a blanket secrecy law. You can't ask anything through freedom of information about anything the Privy Council does. Now, I think that's a constitutional crisis. I don't mind the Queen having a Privy Council. Every monarch deserves a council, but I believe that it should be subject to freedom of information law. I think the Privy Council has been it's become a vehicle for disinformation. And unless there's a democratic check on that, unless we can see its records and minutes, we don't know who's saying what. Is there someone in the Privy Council who's actually working for foreign intelligence against the interests of the UK and saying, yes, we should be bombing Iran. We are the greatest nation on the world. We're America, best ally. We're going for Brexit. We're the great people. We should lend them our nuclear submarines. Let's attack Tehran. Are people saying that on the Privy Council, Is the Queen believing that? Because she might have been so brainwashed by these ignorant fools that she's actually ended up in a space in her head when she hasn't actually had a true conversation with anyone for like 10, 20 years. I don't know. I mean, I'm just discussing this. So I think, yeah, the Privy Council should be absolutely under freedom of information legislation and brought into the democratic process. Because if you recall, the last time that Britain launched an attack on Syria, it was done under Privy Council rules. And even Parliament was not allowed to see the so-called intelligence evidence that justified it. Because, oh, no, too dangerous. Only the Privy Council can see that. And that's how we're going to war against Syria, said Theresa May to Parliament. That she just basically stripped of sovereignty because she's now ruling through the Privy Council. Well, as I wrote to the Speaker and to the heads of political parties, this is a constitutional crisis. And again, it's to do with lies, deceit versus truth. So the killings of hundreds of thousands of civilians in Iraq by the British in collusion with the Americans was an absolute scandal and should still come before the International Court of Justice as a war crime, which is what it was. There was no justification in law for that attack. In my opinion, as a philosopher of justice, let lawyers work out how to bring that prosecution. I know that people have tried, but yeah, happy to discuss with people about that. Okay, that's the second layer of aggregated lies. The third one that I've only just really come across and which scandalises and shocks me, another suppression of truth that's been going on, concerns the Palestinian people and their fate. I mean, I'm chair of this thing called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East. I take the view that, like Archbishop Desmond Tutu did over South Africa, and it was inspired by his work, that we won't get healing between the Palestinians and the Israelis, between the Iranians and the Yemenis and the Saudis, between all these amazing people in the Middle East, the Lebanese, the Armenians, the Jordanians, and all their complex nuances and faith beliefs and all the rest of it. I love the Middle East. I've travelled in Israel and Palestine. I've in my imagination, I've been to the Middle East many times, and I've flown over it to India many times. And I remember looking down on Iran at night on a night flight to Delhi, looking at the lights twinkling away down below, and just feeling, I was writing some Sufi poetry on the plane. That region is beautiful. It should be a peace haven. Instead, it's always teetering on the edge of some kind of warfare and violence. So one of the key things is to reconcile and heal the conflict between the Palestinians and Israelis. Anyone with a brain can figure that's the epicenter of a lot of the problems. The Palestinians are complex, amazing people. I've travelled in Palestine, I've met people from the Palestinian community, both Christian and Muslim and secular, and poets and craftsmen and painters and artists. They're some of the most incredible people I've ever met. Highly intellectual, highly intelligent. I knew the Palestinian representative in London, like the ambassador to London, Afif Safieh, who came to some of my meetings in the House of Lords in the 1990s, an intellectual that was, a genuine deep thinker and a good man. And I've known other intellectuals among the Palestinian community. It's said, I've seen it said that Israelis are also very, very clever and intellectual, and they have many, many PhDs, per head of the population. They have as many as any other nation on earth, apart from the Palestinians. The only people that can match the Israelis are the Palestinians. Well, they're cousins. They are literally, best brothers and sisters. So how can we make peace there? Well, that's what I've been working on. I've been there, I've interviewed people, I've put films on my internet website of interviews with people in Palestinian refugee camps and among Israeli intellectuals and so on. So that's been one of my many missions of peacemaking. And then I learned something this last week, since we last spoke, which I find absolutely shocking and horrendous. Al Jazeera have done documentary over the last few years into the death of Yasir Arafat, who was the Palestinian leader. He was originally, thought that the way to get justice to Palestine is through fighting, and he was what we'd call a terrorist. But only because he felt that his people had been unjustly treated. And then he eventually came in from the cold and decided to go the peace route. He signed the Oslo Accords. He went to Camp David. He shook hands with Rabin and others and said, we will pursue a peace. We will get a just two-state solution. We'll sort out all the problems. I went to a conference at University College around that time with Palestinians and Israeli academics and British and European, and we were discussing how we can get a two-state solution, even down to who will run the water supply of Jerusalem, who will ensure the transport links and so on. One of the most important things is building a railway line between the West Bank and Gaza, so the people of Gaza are not blocked in. It's horrendous what's happened to them. So in a peaceful two-state solution, a railway line is going to be essential. A port, an airport, all these kind of things to rebuild the economic infrastructure of Palestine. It also would have to sign a non-violence treaty with Israel. The independent Palestine would swear to not do terrorism, not do bombings, not do stabbings, not come out of tunnels, not fire these rockets anymore from Gaza into the southern part of Israel. Both sides would have to just take the path of non-violence. It's in the Jewish and Islamic and Christian teachings that non-violence is preferable always. And in Gaza there are many Christian churches, there are many Christians in Gaza. It was actually a Christian centre of theology and so on. Several saints came from Gaza. And I have friends in Gaza who are desperate for peace and justice. So yes, we can't get it with violence. Okay, so then I discovered that Al Jazeera did a forensic investigation into Yasir Arafat's death, which was in 2004, in the mayhem following the attack on Iraq in 2003. In that, and there was so much going on in the world, so much conflict, that we kind of hardly noticed, Arafat got ill and suddenly died. And we all just thought, well, he got ill. That was what the media said. He had flu. He was in Ramallah. The Israelis had been attacking his compound for reasons that I found at the time impossible to comprehend. What did they have against this man that they actually bulldozed his offices? The Makata, as they're called, where his little Palestinian authority was trying to have some kind of say in the affairs of its people. They'd actually gone in with tanks and bulldozed the whole thing, as if some tank came into my Peace Museum here in France and just bulldozed the whole thing and left me with one corner standing. I mean, I thought, this is psychological torture this man is receiving. It's completely unjustified, given that he'd now declared for peace. And he was so loved by his people, he could have brought them in the peace direction to a reasonable two-state agreement with Israel. He had the moral authority. But no, the Israelis were determined to, reduce him to some sort of shriveling wreck of a psychopath. I don't know what they're planning. And I remember at the time thinking, this is horrendous. Somebody ought to tell him to stop. But then he gets ill and he dies suddenly. He has flu-like symptoms in the compound in Ramallah. His doctors don't know what's caused it. They think it's just flu, but it gets worse and worse and worse. He's eventually flown to a hospital in Paris where he was given tests, and only then did they think maybe there's some poison here. Maybe he's been poisoned. They ran tests, couldn't find anything. And he then died. He went into a coma. His dear wife, Suha, was there, and just, his daughter, and they were uncontrollable. This was one of the great men of the 20th century.